Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com. The Telegraph ran this article last week. Britain will soon have a glut of cheap power and world-leading batteries to store it. Trailblazing Britain is leading the most ambitious rollout of offshore wind in the world. Britain will soon have far more power at times of peak production than it can absorb. The logistical headache will be abundance. Wind and solar provided almost 60% of the UK's power for substantial stretches last weekend, briefly peaking at 66%. Then he goes on to say this is not to make a propaganda point about green energy. Now let's look and see if that statement is correct. Britain may have gotten 2/3 of their electricity from wind power for a few minutes, but a few hours earlier they were getting almost none. Wind power in Britain and almost everywhere else is extremely unreliable. They go through long periods of time when there's almost no wind and thus almost no wind power. 4 years ago, Britain went through at least 9 consecutive days without any wind power. And rather than having a glut of electricity, the British government is warning of a tight energy supply this winter. But Ambrose Evans Pritchard says not to worry, Britain's going to have world-leading batteries to store it during times when the wind's not blowing. Britain's batteries may well be world-leading, but a better name for them would be grossly inadequate. The technology simply doesn't exist for Britain to run off of battery power for more than a few minutes or hours. And in the real world, electric car manufacturers like Tesla are scooping up as much battery material as they can. They know that they are facing a looming shortage of essential materials for manufacturing the batteries. The government of Britain is trying to force everybody into electric cars. At the same time, they're planning on making the country dependent on battery-powered electricity for potentially weeks at a time. The technology and raw materials necessary to do this simply don't exist. Not to mention the fact that critical battery materials are being mined by child slaves in Africa. But as far as the political left is concerned, they don't care about child slaves in Africa. They're more concerned with keeping this girl happy, who rode across the Atlantic in a $1 million yacht in order to complain to the United Nations that her childhood was stolen.
This is all wrong. I shouldn't be up here. I should be back in school on the other side of the ocean. Yet you all come to us young people for hope. How dare you? You have stolen my dreams and my childhood with your empty words.
The climate cult is a pretty sick, cynical group of people. On February 12th of last year, USA Today was bragging about wind power in Texas. They said that wind power in Texas produced up to 2/3 of their electricity in 2020. Note that's the same number which Ambrose Evans Pritchard was pitching in his propaganda piece about Britain's wind power. But 2 days later in Texas, on February 14th of last year, the wind turbines froze up, the grid shut down, and lots of people froze to death. Humans have known for tens of thousands of years that they can't survive a cold climate without carbon-based fuels to burn. It would appear that Neanderthals were far more intelligent than modern journalists. A country basing their energy future on statistics about peak power is absurd. We've known for 70 years how to generate huge amounts of peak power without relying on 13th century windmill technology. On January 31st, 1950, President Truman gave the Atomic Energy Commission green light to work on a hydrogen bomb. But if you can't use the energy, it's useless for human beings. People have been trying to figure out how to harness fusion energy for at least 50 years. I grew up in Los Alamos, New Mexico, and they told me at the laboratories that they were 30 years away from harnessing nuclear fusion. And now, 50 years later, we're still 30 years away from harnessing nuclear fusion. They've made some progress, but you can't run a civilization off of wishful thinking. You can't run a country off fake news and disinformation from journalists who have no clue what they're talking about. Toto is hoping that sometime in the near future, actual scientists and engineers will be allowed a voice in the energy policy process. Toto's been pulling back the curtain on these incompetent and corrupt journalists for the past 14 years. You can visit Toto, Kyrie, Caesar, Toki, and Upla on the web at realclimatescience.com.